The family dinner turned ice cold when my father asked the question everyone was avoiding. "Why did you take an Uber tonight, Grace? Is something wrong with that BMW I bought you for your birthday?" Before I could answer, my husband Mark cut me off with a laugh. "Oh, Dad, we had to give that to my mother. You understand, right? Grace barely drives anyway, and Mom has all those important appointments." My mother-in-law Linda nodded sweetly from across the table. "It's much more practical this way, Edward. Grace doesn't really need such an expensive car." The silence that followed was deafening. 20 family members stopped eating and stared as my face burned with shame. My father set down his fork very slowly. His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow felt louder than shouting. "Let me get this straight. My daughter is taking ride shares while my in-laws are driving the $60,000 gift I gave her?" I wanted to disappear, but I had no idea this public humiliation was nothing compared to what they had really stolen from me. The truth about my missing BMW was just the tip of the iceberg. If you're hearing this story, tell me in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? Before we begin today's story, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Now let's get started. Grace Miller pressed her thumb against the cracked plastic of her Medicare card, the edges worn soft from years in her wallet. The card sat beside her morning coffee on the small Formica table, next to an unopened electric bill and a church bulletin folded to the prayer requests page. Outside their Dallas duplex, the Texas sun already promised another scorching day. At 62, Grace had learned to measure mornings by the pills in her weekly organizer. Monday's compartment lay empty, the blood pressure medication and vitamin D already dissolving in her system. She counted Tuesday through Sunday, each day's worth of hope contained in a tiny plastic square. The ritual gave her something to control when everything else felt decided by other people. "Gracie, you ready?" Mark's voice carried from the hallway, followed by the thud of his work boots against the thin carpet. At 58, her husband moved through their cramped home with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his welcome anywhere. His cologne, too strong, too expensive for their budget, drifted into the kitchen as he grabbed his coffee mug from the counter. Grace folded the Medicare card back into her purse, next to the photo of her silver Toyota Camry. The picture showed her smiling behind the wheel the day her father had surprised her with it, the title printed with her name in careful block letters. That was last year, before the car somehow became a point of discussion rather than transportation. "Actually," she said quietly, "I'll need to call a ride." Her fingers found the worn leather strap of her purse, the weight familiar but insufficient. "For Daddy's party." Mark paused in his coffee pouring, the steam rising between them like a question neither wanted to ask. "Right," he said finally. "Mom needed the car for her doctor thing. You understand." Grace understood many things she wished she didn't. She understood that Linda's doctor thing meant lunch with her church friends at the nice restaurant across town. She understood that her own transportation had become a family negotiation rather than a personal right. Most of all, she understood that today, at her father's 80th birthday party, someone would ask where her car was. The rideshare app on her old Android phone showed a 12-minute wait. Grace used the time to change from her house slippers into low black heels. The kind that wouldn't betray her when she walked across Edward Carter's polished floors. She chose her navy cardigan, the one without pills on the sleeves, and checked her reflection in the hallway mirror. What looked back was a woman who had learned to make herself smaller. Her gray hair, styled weekly at the discount salon, framed a face that smiled too quickly and apologized too often. But her eyes, her father's eyes, still held something that refused to bend completely. The notification chimed. "Your driver Marcus is arriving in a blue Honda Civic." Grace gathered her purse and the birthday gift she had wrapped in paper saved from last Christmas, its creases pressed flat with careful hands. Through the window, she watched Mark load a small suitcase into the trunk of her Camry, Linda visible in the passenger seat, already wearing her good jewelry. "See you tonight," Grace called toward the driveway. Mark waved without looking back, the silver car already reversing toward the street. For a moment, watching them drive away in the vehicle her father had specifically chosen for her safety and independence, Grace felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the feeling of being erased one small decision at a time. The Honda Civic smelled of vanilla air freshener and someone else's music. Marcus, a young man with kind eyes and a college parking sticker on his dashboard, helped her with the seatbelt when he noticed her hands shaking slightly. "Big day?" he asked as they pulled away from the duplex. "My father's birthday," Grace said, smoothing her skirt over her knees. "He's 80 today. That's beautiful. Family gatherings are the best." Marcus navigated the late-morning traffic with patient skill, his radio playing soft jazz that reminded Grace of her father's study. "Is it a surprise party?" Grace considered the question as they passed strip malls and chain restaurants, the landscape of a life lived within careful boundaries. "No," she said finally. "I think the surprise will be me showing up without the car he bought me." 20 minutes later, Marcus pulled into the circular driveway of Edward Carter's home in North Dallas. The stone house rose before them, its windows catching the sunlight like a promise kept. Cars lined the drive, luxury SUVs and sedans that spoke of Carter Home's success, of family members who had built lives worthy of their patriarch's investment. "This is it?" Marcus asked, clearly impressed. "Your dad did well for himself." Grace felt the pride and shame war in her chest as she always did when arriving here. Pride in Edward's accomplishments, shame in her own circumstances. "He built houses," she said simply. "Good ones. People trusted him." She paid Marcus through the app, adding a generous tip from money she had saved from her small Social Security check. As the Honda disappeared around the tree-lined curve, Grace stood alone in the driveway. Surrounded by vehicles that represented the kind of financial stability that had somehow slipped through her fingers. The front door opened before she could ring the bell. Edward Carter appeared in the doorway, tall despite his 80 years, his silver hair combed back in the same style he'd worn since Grace was a child. His eyes the same hazel as hers took in her arrival. And the absence of her car with the kind of quiet attention that had made him successful in business and beloved by his family. "Baby girl," he said, opening his arms. "Right on time." Grace stepped into his embrace, breathing in the scent of his aftershave and the faint smell of wood polish from the house behind him. For a moment, surrounded by his warmth and the solid reality of his love, she felt safe enough to imagine telling him everything. But then Linda's laugh drifted from somewhere inside the house, followed by Mark's voice explaining something to the gathered cousins, and Grace remembered that some truths required more courage than a daughter should need on her father's birthday. "Come on," Edward sighed, his arms still around her shoulders. "Everyone's excited to see you." He paused, his eyes moving toward the driveway again. "Though I have to ask, where's that Camry I put you in? Don't tell me it's already giving you trouble." Grace's throat tightened around the words she couldn't say. Instead, she smiled the smile she had perfected over decades of disappointment. "It's running fine, Daddy. Mark he had to use it today." Edward's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "Had to use it," he repeated quietly. "I see." As they walked toward the sound of family voices and celebration, Grace wondered if her father heard the same wrong note in her words that she did. Behind them, the driveway stretched empty where her car should have been, a space that somehow contained all the small surrenders that had brought her to this moment, arriving as a guest at her own father's party, dependent on strangers for transportation, explaining away gifts that had been redirected without her true consent. The house smelled of her father's success, leather and furniture, polish, and the expensive food he ordered when he wanted to show his family how much they meant to him. Grace stepped inside, her heels clicking against marble floors, and prepared to spend the afternoon pretending that everything was exactly as it should be. The ride home from Edward's party felt longer than the journey there. Grace sat in the back of another rideshare, this time a worn sedan that smelled of coffee and old upholstery. Watching the familiar streets of her neighborhood grow shabbier as they moved away from her father's prosperity. The driver, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes, kept glancing in the rearview mirror at Grace's silence. "Good party?" the driver asked as they stopped at a red light near the discount grocery store where Grace shopped with carefully clipped coupons. "My father turned 80 today," Grace replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Through the window, she watched a young mother push a stroller across the cracked parking lot, one wheel squeaking with each rotation. "He asked about my car." The driver nodded, understanding. "Family stuff's complicated." Grace's fingers worried the clasp of her purse as they turned onto her street. The duplex Mark had chosen 3 years ago looked smaller in the evening light, its white paint peeling near the foundation. The small front yard dominated by a chain-link fence that separated their lives from their neighbors. In the driveway, her silver Camry sat exactly where it belonged, as if it had never left. Inside the house, the air conditioning hummed with the strain of fighting Texas heat through thin walls. Mark sat at the kitchen table, still wearing his good shirt from the party, a stack of mail spread before him. Like playing cards in a game Grace didn't understand. Linda occupied the couch in the living room, her shoes kicked off, remote control balanced on her stomach as she flipped through channels. "How was the drive back?" Grace asked, setting her purse on the counter next to the coffee maker that hadn't worked properly in months. "Fine," Mark said without looking up from an envelope he was slicing open with practiced efficiency. Dad seemed happy. "Good turnout." Grace watched him sort the mail into piles: bills, advertising circulars, official-looking letters with government logos. Her name appeared on several envelopes, but Mark's hands moved them toward his section of the table without pause. The casual authority of the gesture made something cold settle in her stomach. "What's all this?" she asked, moving closer to see the letterheads. Social Security Administration, Medicare, the Department of Veterans Affairs. "Just the usual stuff," Mark said, his voice carrying the patient tone he used when explaining things he considered too complicated for her to understand. "Insurance updates, benefits notifications. Nothing urgent." Grace's eyes caught on a thick envelope with her name printed in bold letters across the front. Inside the clear address window, she could see the Medicare logo and the words, "Explanation of benefits," in red ink. Her heartbeat quickened as she remembered the conversation at the party, her cousin Rachel's warning about mysterious Medicare charges showing up on statements. "Can I see that one?" Grace asked, reaching for the Medicare envelope. Mark's hand covered it smoothly, his fingers drumming once against the paper. "It's just routine billing stuff, Gracie. You know how confusing these forms are. Let me handle the paperwork like always." But Grace's hand didn't retreat. For the first time in years, she maintained her position, her fingertips touching the corner of the envelope that bore her name. "It's addressed to me," she said quietly. "I should read my own mail." The kitchen went silent except for the refrigerator's cycling hum and the distant sound of Linda's television. Mark's face shifted almost imperceptibly, the easy smile tightening at the corners. After a moment that felt much longer than it was, he released the envelope. "Of course," he said. "I was just organizing everything for you." Grace took the envelope to the small dining area, where late afternoon sunlight streamed through windows that needed cleaning. The paper felt substantial in her hands, official and important in a way that made her nervous. Inside, she found 3 pages of dense text and numbers, medical codes and dollar amounts that seemed to dance before her eyes in the failing light. But certain details emerged with startling clarity. Podiatry services at a clinic she had never visited. Injection therapies for arthritis in joints that didn't bother her. Physical therapy sessions scheduled on days when she had been working her volunteer shift at the church food bank. All approved and paid for by Medicare under her name and identification number. Grace's throat went dry as she scanned the dates. Last Tuesday, when she had spent the afternoon helping sort donations in the church basement, according to this document. She had been receiving treatment for diabetic foot care at a clinic 40 minutes away. The invoice showed a copayment of $35, marked as collected at time of service. "Mark," she called, her voice sounding strange in her own ears. "This shows medical visits I never made." Mark appeared in the doorway, beer in hand, his expression carefully neutral. "Let me take a look," he said, reaching for the papers. "Sometimes they get the coding wrong. It's a mess, the whole system." Grace pulled the documents closer to her chest. "But look at these dates. This says I was at a foot clinic last Tuesday. I was at church all afternoon. Mrs. Peterson can verify that." "Gracie, you're overthinking this." Mark's voice carried a hint of impatience now, the tone she had learned to recognize as a warning. "These billing departments make mistakes all the time. I'll call them tomorrow and get it straightened out." But Grace was studying the clinic's address, her finger tracing the printed letters. The location was in the same medical complex where Linda received her monthly arthritis treatments. The same complex where Linda had complained loudly at last. Month's family dinner about the long wait times and uncomfortable chairs in the physical therapy section. This is Dr. Patel's office, Grace said slowly. Where your mother goes for her feet. Mark took a long pull from his beer, the bottle making a soft sound as he set it on the table. Coincidence? There are probably dozens of foot doctors in that building. Grace turned to the second page, her reading glasses sliding down her nose as she searched for more details. The pattern became clear with sickening certainty. Every service listed corresponded to a complaint. Linda had mentioned every date aligned with an afternoon when Mark had driven his mother to routine appointments, while Grace stayed home or went about her own activities. Someone used my information, Grace said, the words feeling heavy and foreign in her mouth. Someone used my Medicare card to pay for Linda's treatments. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. From the living room came the sound of a commercial for Medicare Advantage plans, the cheerful voice. Promising, no hidden costs and simple enrollment for seniors who qualify. Mark sat down across from her, his face settling into the expression of patient concern she had seen him use with difficult clients at his old job. Honey, listen to me. Sometimes these insurance things get crossed up. People have similar names, similar birthdays. It's probably just a computer error. But Grace was remembering other things now. The afternoon Mark had asked to borrow her Medicare card to verify something with the pharmacy. The times he had volunteered to handle her prescription pickups and returned with medications she didn't recognize. Saying they were vitamins, the doctor added. The way Linda always seemed to know details about Grace's supposed medical appointments that Grace herself couldn't recall. She stood up abruptly, the papers scattering slightly as she moved toward the kitchen counter where her purse sat. Inside, her Medicare card rested in its usual place, the plastic worn soft from years of careful handling. But as she examined it more closely in the overhead light, she noticed something that made her stomach lurch. The card looked newer than it should, the plastic shinier, the printing crisper than she remembered. When did I get a new Medicare card? She asked, holding it up to catch the light better. Mark glanced over, his beer halfway to his lips. They send replacement cards automatically sometimes. Security updates. You probably just forgot. Grace turned the card over, looking for any signs of when it might have been issued. The back held the same warnings about not sharing her Medicare number that she had read dozens of times. But the font seemed different somehow, slightly smaller than she remembered. Had she really forgotten receiving a replacement? The possibility made her feel unreliable, confused about her own memory in a way that was almost worse than the suspicion. She returned to the table, spreading the EOB pages out in front of her again. This time she noticed something else, a small notation at the bottom of the page that read, "Primary insured contacted regarding copayment arrangements." But Grace had never been contacted about any copayments. She would have remembered such a conversation, would have questioned charges for services she hadn't received. I'm going to call the clinic tomorrow, she announced, her voice stronger than she felt. I want to speak to someone about these charges. Mark leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. That's fine, he said. But don't get yourself worked up over computer glitches. You know how these places are, they probably have thousands of patients and mix things up all the time. Grace nodded, but something in his quick agreement made her more suspicious rather than less. Why wasn't he more concerned about potential identity theft? Why didn't he seem surprised by the documented evidence that someone had been impersonating her at medical appointments? Later that evening, as Mark showered and Linda dozed on the couch with her mouth slightly open, Grace sat alone at the kitchen table with a notebook and pen. She wrote down every date from the Medicare statement, then tried to remember what she had been doing on each of those days. Church volunteer work, grocery shopping, an afternoon spent mending clothes while listening to the radio. The pattern that emerged made her hands tremble as she wrote. Every fraudulent appointment had occurred when she was occupied elsewhere, when Mark would have known exactly where she was and how long she would be gone. Every service matched something Linda had complained about needing but couldn't afford on her own Medicare coverage. Grace closed the notebook and sat in the growing darkness of her kitchen, the overhead light casting harsh shadows across her aging hands. Outside, her silver Camry sat in the driveway, visible through the window, looking innocent and ordinary in the streetlight's glow. But even that gift from her father now seemed connected to a web of control and deception she was only beginning to understand. When Mark emerged from the bathroom, hair damp and smelling of soap, he found her still sitting at the table. "You okay, Gracie? You look worried." Grace looked up at him, this man she had trusted with her finances, her future, her very identity. "I'm fine," she said, the lie sitting bitter on her tongue. "Just tired." But she wasn't fine, and tired didn't begin to describe the exhaustion that came from realizing how thoroughly she had been betrayed. As Mark kissed her goodnight and disappeared into their bedroom, Grace remained at the table, staring at the Medicare statement that might as well have been evidence in a crime she hadn't known was being committed against her. The house settled around her with small creaking sounds, and from somewhere in the walls came the faint scurrying of mice that lived in the spaces between her life and the truth. Grace folded the Medicare papers carefully and placed them in the bottom drawer of the kitchen desk, beneath the warranty information for appliances that had long since stopped working. Tomorrow, she decided, she would make that phone call to the clinic. Tomorrow, she would start asking the questions she should have asked months ago. But tonight, sitting alone in the kitchen of a house she didn't own, Grace Miller began the long process of admitting to herself that the small surrenders and compromises that had defined her marriage might actually have been something much worse. The realization felt like swallowing stones, heavy and indigestible in her chest. But it was the weight of truth, and after years of carrying the lighter burden of denial, Grace found herself almost relieved to finally feel the full measure of what she was up against. The morning after Grace discovered the Medicare fraud, she woke to the sound of Mark's voice in the kitchen, low and urgent. Through the thin bedroom wall, she caught fragments of a conversation that made her stomach tighten. "She's getting suspicious. And, we need to handle this carefully." Grace lay still, her body rigid under the worn sheets, as the reality of her situation settled over her like a heavy blanket. When she finally emerged from the bedroom, Mark sat at the table with his laptop open, fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard. The Medicare statement from the previous evening had vanished, replaced by a stack of grocery store circulars and utility bills. Linda stood at the stove, making scrambled eggs with an unusual amount of attention to the task. "Morning, honey," Mark said without looking up from his screen. "Sleep well?" Grace poured herself coffee from the pot, noting that it was stronger than usual, as if someone had been awake much earlier than normal. "Who were you talking to?" she asked. "Work stuff," Mark replied, closing the laptop with a soft click. "They want me to come in early today. Handle some client issues." But Grace knew Mark hadn't worked a steady job in 8 months. The unemployment checks had stopped coming weeks ago, around the same time the credit card bills had started piling up in the locked desk drawer. She stirred sugar into her coffee and watched Linda scrape eggs onto a plate with unnecessary force. "Where did you put my Medicare papers?" Grace asked. Linda's spatula clattered against the pan. Mark's fingers drummed once against the closed laptop before he answered. "I filed them away. Safekeeping. You know how important those documents are." Grace set down her coffee cup, the ceramic making a sharp sound against the Formica table. "I want them back. I'm calling that clinic today." The kitchen went quiet except for the refrigerator's labored breathing and the distant sound of morning traffic. Linda turned from the stove, her face flushed from the heat, holding the spatula like a weapon. "Gracie," Linda said, her voice carrying a sweetness that didn't reach her eyes, "you don't want to make trouble over paperwork mistakes. These medical offices, they're so disorganized. You call them up, start asking questions, they might decide to audit your whole account." Grace felt something cold creep up her spine. "Audit my account?" Mark leaned back in his chair, assuming the patient expression he wore when explaining things to difficult people. "Mom's right. Sometimes when seniors start questioning charges, the insurance companies assume there's been identity theft. They freeze accounts, demand investigations. It can take months to sort out. But if someone really has been using my information," Grace began. "Then we handle it quietly," Mark interrupted. "Through proper channels. I know people in the medical billing business. Let me make some calls, see what I can find out without raising red flags." Grace stared at her husband, this man who claimed to know people in every industry but somehow remained unemployed. The offer to help sounded reasonable, protective even, but something in his eagerness to control the process made her deeply uneasy. "I think I should handle my own medical records," she said. Linda laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "Oh honey, you couldn't handle a parking ticket without getting confused. Remember when you tried to dispute that charge at the grocery store last month? You got so flustered they had to call Mark to come pick you up." The memory made Grace's cheeks burn. She had questioned a charge for expensive steaks she hadn't bought, only to discover that Mark had shopped earlier using her debit card. The teenage cashier had looked at her with pity as Grace struggled to explain why she didn't remember purchasing $30 worth of meat. "That was different," Grace said weakly. "Was it?" Mark asked gently. "Gracie, I love you, but you've been forgetting things. Getting confused about dates, places. It's normal at your age, but it's why I handle the complicated stuff. To protect you." Grace felt the familiar sensation of the ground shifting beneath her feet, the way conversations with Mark always seemed to end with her doubting her own perceptions. But this time, instead of accepting his explanation, she held onto the image of those Medicare documents, the specific dates, the precise dollar amounts, the clinic address that matched Linda's frequent complaints about her arthritis treatments. "I wasn't confused about those medical appointments," she said firmly. "I never had those treatments. Someone else did, using my name." Mark and Linda exchanged a look across the kitchen, a moment of silent communication that excluded Grace completely. When Linda spoke again, her voice had lost all pretense of sweetness. "Listen, Grace. You want to call that clinic and make a fool of yourself, that's your business. But don't drag this family into your paranoid fantasies. Mark works hard to keep us afloat, and I won't have you jeopardizing our stability because you can't keep track of your own medical care." Grace felt as if she had been slapped. "Paranoid fantasies? You think we're stealing from you," Linda continued, her voice rising. "Your own husband, your own family. Do you know how that sounds? How ungrateful and cruel that is." Mark reached across the table and covered Grace's hand with his own. His skin felt warm and slightly damp, the touch meant to be comforting but somehow possessive instead. "Nobody's stealing from anybody, Gracie. We're family. We take care of each other." But Grace was remembering other conversations, other moments when her concerns had been dismissed as confusion or ingratitude. The time she had questioned why their savings account balance seemed lower than expected, only to be told she was miscalculating the automatic deductions. The afternoon she had asked about the life insurance policy her father had helped her purchase, only to learn that Mark had changed the beneficiary designation for tax purposes. Each time, she had accepted the explanations because questioning them meant questioning everything: her marriage, her judgment, her place in the world. But now, with the evidence of the Medicare fraud fresh in her mind, those old explanations began to crumble. "I want to see our bank statements," she said suddenly. Mark's hand tightened slightly on hers. "Our financial information is private, honey. You don't need to worry about that stuff." "It's my money too," Grace said, her voice stronger than she felt. "My social security, my pension. I have a right to see where it goes." Linda slammed the spatula onto the counter with enough force to make the coffee cups rattle. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," she said. This suspicious, accusatory attitude. "It's not normal, Grace. Normal wives trust their husbands." Grace pulled her hand free from Mark's grip and stood up, her legs unsteady but determined. "Normal husbands don't hide bank statements from their wives." The silence that followed felt dangerous, charged with the electricity that comes before thunderstorms. Mark's face had gone very still, his eyes fixed on Grace with an intensity that made her want to step backward. Linda's breathing had become audible, sharp and angry. "You want to see bank statements?" Mark said finally, his voice soft and controlled. "Fine. You want to question every decision I've made to keep this family together? That's your choice. But understand something, Gracie, if you start this fight, if you go down this road of accusations and investigations, there's no going back." Grace felt the weight of his words, the implicit threat wrapped in concern. But for the first time in years, the fear of his disapproval felt less powerful than the need to know the truth. "Maybe there shouldn't be any going back," she said quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering for years. Linda's mouth fell open slightly, and Mark's carefully controlled expression cracked for just a moment, revealing something harder underneath. Think very carefully about what you're saying, Mark said, standing slowly. At 6 feet tall, he had always used his height to emphasize points during arguments. Looming over Grace in a way that felt protective or threatening depending on his mood. Think about what you have without me. This house, your car, your medical coverage, it's all connected to my work, my benefits. You start making trouble, questioning arrangements that have worked for years, you might find yourself in a very difficult position. Grace looked around the kitchen that had never quite felt like home, with its mismatched chairs and appliances that Mark had chosen without consulting her. She thought about the Camry sitting in the driveway, the car her father had given her but Mark controlled. She considered the Medicare coverage that was apparently being used by someone else. The bank accounts she wasn't allowed to see, the life insurance policy with a beneficiary she hadn't chosen. I think I'm already in a difficult position, she said. Mark's laugh was short and humorless. You have no idea how difficult things can get, Gracie. But you're about to find out. He grabbed his laptop and left the kitchen, his footsteps heavy on the stairs as he climbed to the bedroom they shared. Linda followed without a word, leaving Grace alone with the breakfast dishes and the growing realization that her marriage had just become a war. An hour later, Grace sat at the kitchen table with the cordless phone in her hand, the number for Dr. Patel's clinic written on a scrap of paper in front of her. Her fingers trembled as she dialed, partly from nervousness and partly from the 3 cups of coffee she had consumed while building up her courage. Patel Family Medicine, this is Jennifer, how can I help you? Grace cleared her throat. I'm calling about some charges on my Medicare statement. My name is Grace Miller, and I have some questions about services that were supposedly provided to me. Let me pull up your account, Jennifer said, her voice friendly and efficient. Can you give me your date of birth and Medicare number? Grace provided the information, her heart racing as she heard computer keys clicking on the other end of the line. After a moment, Jennifer returned to the phone, her tone slightly more formal than before. Mrs. Miller, I see you've been a patient here for about 6 months. Your last visit was actually just last Thursday for follow-up diabetic foot care. Did you need to schedule another appointment? Grace's hand tightened on the phone. I've never been to your clinic. I don't have diabetes, and I certainly wasn't there last Thursday. The line went quiet for several seconds. When Jennifer spoke again, she sounded confused and slightly suspicious. Ma'am, I'm looking at your file right here. You've had multiple appointments, and your daughter-in-law has been handling the copayments and transportation. She explained that you sometimes get confused about your appointments due to your memory issues. The words hit Grace like a physical blow. My daughter-in-law? Linda Miller. She's listed as your emergency contact and medical representative. She told us you'd given her power of attorney for medical decisions because of your condition. Grace felt the room spinning slightly as the full scope of the deception became clear. Not only had someone been using her Medicare information, but they had constructed an entire fictional narrative about her mental capacity to justify their access to her medical care. I need to speak to someone in charge, Grace said, her voice barely steady. Right now. 20 minutes later, after being transferred through 3 different departments and explaining her situation repeatedly, Grace found herself speaking to the clinic's office manager. The woman's voice was carefully neutral as she explained the clinic's policies regarding patient representatives and medical power of attorney. Mrs. Miller, I understand your concerns, but according to our records, you signed authorization forms giving your daughter-in-law permission to handle your medical affairs. The forms are dated from when you first became a patient, and your signature is on file. Grace gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles ached. I never signed anything. I've never been to your clinic. I don't even know where it's located. The clinic is at 1247 Medical Plaza Drive, in the same complex as the Arthritis Center and the Diabetes Clinic. Your daughter-in-law mentioned that you often accompany her to her own appointments in the building, which is how you became familiar with our services. The address confirmed Grace's worst suspicions. It was exactly where Linda received her monthly arthritis treatments, the same building where she complained about long waits and uncomfortable chairs. Grace could picture it now, Linda checking in for her own appointment. Then somehow using Grace's information to receive additional services that Medicare would cover. I want copies of everything, Grace said. Every form with my supposed signature, every bill, every record you have. I'll be there this afternoon to pick them up. The office manager's voice became even more cautious. Mrs. Miller, I'll need to verify your identity and check with our legal department about releasing those records. Given your daughter-in-law's concerns about your mental state, we'll need to be very careful about how we handle this situation. Grace felt the trap closing around her, the careful construction of lies and forged documents creating a reality where her own word was suspect. But instead of the usual helplessness that such situations brought, she felt a burning clarity that surprised her with its intensity. Then I'll bring my own identification, she said firmly. And I'll bring someone else to verify that I am perfectly capable of handling my own affairs. This is fraud, and I intend to prove it. After she hung up the phone, Grace sat quietly in her kitchen, the morning sun streaming through windows that needed cleaning, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. Upstairs, she could hear Mark's voice again, low and urgent, punctuated by Linda's higher tones. They were planning something, adjusting their strategy now that Grace had begun to fight back. But for the first time in years, Grace felt something stronger than fear. She felt angry, righteously and purely angry, in a way that burned away the confusion and self-doubt that had paralyzed her for so long. They had stolen more than her money or her medical identity. They had stolen her sense of reality, her trust in her own perceptions, her right to exist as a competent adult in the world. Now that she knew the scope of their deception, Grace Miller was ready to fight back with every resource at her disposal. The war Mark had threatened was already underway, and she intended to win it not just for her own sake, but for every other elderly person who had been silenced by the people who were supposed to protect them. The afternoon promised to be difficult, but Grace no longer feared difficult. She feared only the possibility of remaining silent while her life was stolen piece by piece, signature by forged signature, lie by carefully constructed lie. The afternoon heat pressed against the windows of Dr. Patel's clinic as Grace sat in the waiting room, clutching a manila folder containing every piece of documentation she could gather about her identity. Her birth certificate, Medicare card, Social Security statement, and a handwritten timeline of the fraudulent appointments filled the folder. With the weight of evidence she hoped would restore her credibility. Beside her sat Mrs. Eleanor Washington, a 70-year-old woman from her church who had volunteered to serve as a character witness. Eleanor had known Grace for 15 years, had worked alongside her in the food bank every Tuesday, and possessed the kind of sharp memory and unshakable dignity that commanded respect from medical professionals and bureaucrats alike. "You don't look nervous," Eleanor observed, her voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who had spent decades teaching elementary school. "Good. Nervous women get dismissed. Confident women get listened to." Grace touched the cross pendant at her throat, a gift from her late mother that she wore whenever she needed courage. "I feel like I'm about to take a test I didn't study for." "Honey, you've been studying for this test your whole life. You just didn't know it." The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and old magazines, the kind of institutional sterility that made everyone speak in hushed tones. Grace watched other patients check in at the reception desk, noting how casually they provided their insurance cards, how easily they trusted that their information would be protected and used only for their own care. "Mrs. Miller?" A woman in scrubs appeared at the doorway leading to the administrative offices. "I'm Carol Peterson, the office manager we spoke with. Would you like to come back?" Grace and Eleanor followed Carol down a narrow hallway lined with motivational posters about diabetes management and heart health. The office manager's workspace was cramped but organized, with filing cabinets covering every available wall space and a computer monitor that had seen better days. Carol settled behind her desk, a stack of papers already waiting. Her expression was carefully neutral, the look of someone who dealt with insurance disputes and family disagreements on a regular basis. "Mrs. Miller, I have to tell you, this is a very unusual situation. In 20 years of managing medical offices, I've never had someone claim they've never been a patient when we have extensive records of their care." Grace opened her manila folder and placed her documentation on the desk with deliberate precision. "Then this will be a first for both of us." Carol examined Grace's identification, comparing the Medicare card to the information on her computer screen. After several minutes of cross-referencing, she looked up with a slight frown. The numbers match perfectly, but I have to ask, have you been experiencing any memory issues lately? Sometimes patients forget appointments, especially if they're dealing with stress or medication changes. Eleanor leaned forward, her teacher's voice cutting through the polite euphemisms. Carol, this woman has been volunteering at our church food bank every Tuesday for 5 years. Never missed a day. I can show you sign-in sheets going back months. On 3 of the dates when you claim she was here receiving medical care. She was sorting canned goods with me from 9 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon. Carol's fingers moved across her keyboard as she pulled up the appointment records. Let me see. Yes, here's the appointment from last month. Tuesday, October 15th, 2 o'clock appointment for diabetic foot care and medication consultation. The notes show that Linda Miller, listed as the patient's daughter-in-law and medical representative, drove the patient to the appointment and assisted with intake forms due to the patient's confusion and hearing difficulties. Grace felt her face burning. I don't have hearing difficulties. I don't have diabetes. And I was at church that entire afternoon. According to our records, you've been receiving treatment for type 2 diabetes for 6 months. Your daughter-in-law provided a complete medical history during your initial consultation, including medication lists and previous provider information. Eleanor pulled a spiral notebook from her purse and flipped to a page covered with careful handwriting. October 15th was the day we organized donations for the Martinez family. Grace spent the afternoon calling local businesses for additional contributions. I have her listed here as making 14 calls between noon and 4 o'clock. Carol studied Eleanor's meticulous records, her professional composure beginning to crack slightly. Mrs. Miller, if what you're saying is true, then someone has been impersonating you for medical services. That's a serious federal crime. That's exactly what I'm saying, Grace replied. I want to see every piece of paper with my supposed signature. I want copies of everything. Carol hesitated, her fingers drumming against her desk. I'll need to make some phone calls first. This involves HIPAA privacy laws and potential fraud investigation. Our legal department will need to review the situation before we can release those records. Grace felt the familiar pattern beginning: the delays, the consultations, the bureaucratic maze designed to exhaust complainants into giving up. But this time, instead of accepting the runaround, she stood up and moved to the door. Then I'm calling the Medicare fraud hotline right now, she announced. And the police. If you won't show me these fraudulent records, maybe federal investigators will have better luck getting access. Carol's face went pale. Mrs. Miller, please. Let's not escalate this unnecessarily. Give me 1 hour to make some calls and review our procedures. If you can come back this evening, I'll have everything ready for you. Grace paused in the doorway, Eleanor beside her like a bodyguard in sensible shoes. 1 hour. But understand something: I'm not going away. I'm not getting confused or forgetting about this. And I'm not accepting any more excuses. As they walked back through the waiting room, Grace felt every eye on them, the kind of attention that comes when raised voices leak through thin walls. At the reception desk, the young woman who had checked them in looked up with curiosity and concern. Everything okay? She asked quietly. Grace stopped, studying the receptionist's face. The woman looked to be in her 20s, with the kind of earnest expression that suggested she actually cared about her job rather than just collecting a paycheck. Can I ask you something? Grace said. Do you remember checking in a Grace Miller for appointments over the past few months? The receptionist glanced nervously toward the hallway leading to the administrative offices. I'm not supposed to discuss patient information. Eleanor stepped closer to the desk, her voice gentle but persuasive. Honey, we're not asking for medical details. We just want to know if you've ever seen this woman before today. The receptionist looked directly at Grace for a long moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. I don't think so, she said slowly. I mean, I see a lot of patients, but I usually remember the regulars, especially the elderly clients. I don't recall ever checking you in. Grace felt a spark of hope. What about a woman named Linda Miller? Older, around 70, usually complaining about wait times or the temperature in the waiting room. Recognition dawned on the receptionist's face. Oh, Mrs. Linda Miller, yes. She comes in regularly for her mother-in-law's appointments. Always pays in cash, always seems rushed. She usually explains that her mother-in-law has to wait in the car because of anxiety issues. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Linda had been using Grace's Medicare information while claiming Grace was too mentally impaired to come inside herself. The receptionist had never actually seen Grace because Grace had never actually been there. "Thank you," Grace said quietly. "You've been very helpful." Outside the medical complex, the late afternoon sun beat down on the asphalt parking lot, making the air shimmer with heat waves. Grace sat in Eleanor's car, the air conditioning struggling against the Texas autumn, and felt the full weight of betrayal settle into her bones. 30 years, she said, staring at her hands folded in her lap. "I've been married to that man for 30 years, and this is what it comes to." Eleanor adjusted her rearview mirror and studied Grace's profile. "Honey, what comes to this is that you trusted someone who didn't deserve it. That's not a character flaw. That's being human. But how did I not see it? How did I let them convince me that I was confused, forgetful, unreliable?" Grace's voice cracked on the last word. "They made me doubt my own memory, my own experiences. They made me feel crazy. They made you feel exactly what they needed you to feel to get away with it," Eleanor said firmly. "That's what abusers do. They don't just steal your money, they steal your confidence, your sense of reality. They make you an accomplice to your own victimization." Grace pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to hold back tears that had been building for hours. But the pressure was too great, the accumulated shame and anger and grief too heavy to contain. The sobs came in waves, her shoulders shaking as years of suppressed doubt and fear poured out in the front seat of Eleanor's Buick. "I feel so stupid," she gasped between sobs. "So incredibly stupid." Eleanor reached across the seat and took Grace's hands in her own, the older woman's skin paper thin but warm and steady. "Listen to me, Grace Miller. The stupid people are the ones who thought they could steal from you and get away with it. The smart woman is the one sitting here right now, fighting back." They sat in the parking lot as the sun began to set, painting the medical complex in shades of orange and gold. Around them, the normal life of the city continued, people finishing work, picking up prescriptions, hurrying home to families who would greet them with honesty rather than deception. Grace used the tissues Eleanor provided to clean her face and compose herself. In the side mirror, she saw a woman who looked older than her 62 years. But whose eyes held something that hadn't been there that morning, a steely determination that no amount of gaslighting could erode. "What do I do now?" she asked. Eleanor started the car, the engine purring to life with reliable precision. "Now you go home and pack a bag. Tonight you're staying with me. Tomorrow we call every agency that handles elder fraud. And we make sure Mark and Linda learn that stealing from seniors isn't a family matter, it's a federal crime." Grace nodded, feeling something she hadn't experienced in years. The sensation of having an ally, someone who believed her story and was willing to fight beside her. As Eleanor pulled out of the parking lot, Grace looked back at the medical building where her identity had been stolen and her reality had been restored. The building grew smaller in the distance, but Grace's resolve only grew larger. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations, painful revelations, and the hard work of reclaiming a life that had been systematically dismantled. But tonight, for the first time in months, she would sleep in a place where her word was trusted and her perceptions were valued. The war Mark had threatened was truly beginning now, but Grace Miller was no longer fighting it alone. And as Eleanor's car merged into traffic, carrying them toward whatever came next, Grace felt something she had almost forgotten existed: hope that justice was not only possible, but inevitable. The dashboard clock showed 6:47 p.m. as they drove through neighborhoods where families were gathering for dinner, where husbands and wives shared the details of their days with honesty and respect. Grace watched those lighted windows pass by and made a silent promise to herself: never again would she accept less than the truth, no matter how uncomfortable or inconvenient it might be. The old Grace, the one who had awakened that morning in a house full of lies, was gone forever. The woman riding toward freedom in Eleanor's passenger seat was someone new, someone forged in the fire of betrayal and cooled in the waters of righteous anger. She was someone who would not be silenced, dismissed, or forgotten. Someone who intended to win. Eleanor's guest bedroom smelled of lavender and old books, a combination that reminded Grace of her grandmother's house from childhood. The bed was small but comfortable, with a handmade quilt that told the story of someone who valued craftsmanship over convenience. Grace sat on the edge, still wearing her clothes from the clinic visit, holding a cup of chamomile tea that had long since gone cold. Through the window, she could see Eleanor's backyard garden, where tomato plants grew in careful rows and marigolds bordered the fence like golden sentinels. Everything about this house spoke of intentionality, of choices made by someone who understood the difference between what was necessary and what was merely expedient. Grace's mind drifted back 40 years, to another garden in another time. She was 22 then, fresh out of nursing school, sitting on her father's back porch as he planted roses for her upcoming wedding. Edward had paused in his digging, dirt caked under his fingernails, and looked at her with the kind of serious attention that meant an important conversation was coming. "Baby girl," he had said, leaning on his shovel, "marriage is like building a house. You can put up something quick and cheap that looks good for a while, or you can lay a foundation that'll last through storms. The difference is in how much truth you're willing to build on." Grace had laughed, young and certain that love was enough to overcome any practical concerns. "Daddy, you worry too much. Mark and I understand each other." Edward had returned to his planting, but she remembered the way he had pressed each rose bush into the earth with extra care, as if he was trying to anchor something permanent in a world of shifting uncertainties. "Understanding's different from agreeing," he had said quietly. "Make sure you know which one you've got." Now, sitting in Eleanor's guest room with the weight of betrayal settling into her bones, Grace understood what her father had been trying to tell her. She and Mark had never truly understood each other. She had mistaken his confidence for strength, his control for care, his dismissal of her concerns for protection from complicated realities. The early years of their marriage flickered through her memory like scenes from a movie she had watched too many times. Mark arriving home from his job at the insurance company, his tie loosened, talking about deals and clients with the enthusiasm of someone who believed the world was full of opportunities waiting to be seized. Grace cooking dinner in their small apartment, listening to his plans for their future, with the kind of trust that came from wanting to believe in someone else's dreams. She remembered the first time she had questioned one of his financial decisions. They had been married 3 years, and Mark had suggested combining their savings accounts, for efficiency. Grace had hesitated, not out of suspicion but from a vague sense that she should understand their money situation better before agreeing to anything. Mark's response had been swift and effective. He had pulled out a stack of bank statements, insurance policies, and investment prospectuses, spreading them across their kitchen table like evidence in a case she hadn't known she was defending. "Gracie," he had said with patient exasperation, "do you really want to spend your evenings trying to figure out compound interest rates and tax implications? Let me handle the boring stuff so you can focus on the things you're good at." The dismissal had been gentle but complete. Grace was good at nursing, at caring for people, at making homes comfortable and welcoming. Financial planning was complicated, masculine territory that required education and experience she didn't possess. The message was clear: stay in your lane, trust me with mine. Grace had agreed because arguing would have meant admitting she didn't understand terms like portfolio diversification and tax-deferred growth. The shame of her ignorance had felt worse than the fear of losing control. So she had signed the papers that combined their accounts, and with each signature, she had traded a piece of her independence for the comfort of not having to worry about things that confused her. The pattern had repeated itself over the decades, each surrender feeling reasonable in isolation but adding up to a complete abdication of financial awareness. When Mark suggested taking over her Social Security account management, for optimization, Grace had agreed. When he recommended changing her Medicare coverage, to get better benefits, she had trusted his research. When he asked for power of attorney, in case of emergencies, she had signed without reading the fine print. Each decision had been presented as protection, but Grace now understood that she had been protected right out of her own life. She rose from the bed and walked to Eleanor's dresser, where a small mirror reflected her face in the lamplight. The woman looking back had the same features she had worn for 62 years, but something fundamental had changed in her expression. The eager-to-please softness around her eyes had hardened into something more determined. The apologetic set of her mouth had straightened into a line that suggested she was done making excuses for other people's behavior. Grace thought about her father's roses, how they had required careful tending but had bloomed for decades in his garden. Edward had taught her that beautiful things demanded attention and respect, that neglect was often disguised as benevolence, that true care meant allowing things to grow according to their own nature rather than forcing them into convenient shapes. Mark had never learned those lessons. He had treated their marriage like a business acquisition, absorbing her assets and autonomy while convincing her that the transaction was for her own benefit. He had pruned away her independence so gradually that she hadn't noticed until almost nothing remained of the woman her father had raised. But sitting in Eleanor's guest room, surrounded by the evidence of a life lived with dignity and intention, Grace felt something stirring that she had thought was permanently lost. It was the voice of the young nurse who had once advocated fiercely for her patients, who had refused to let hospital administrators cut corners on care, who had believed that standing up for what was right was worth the discomfort it might cause. That woman had been buried under decades of compromise and conflict avoidance, but she wasn't dead. Grace could feel her awakening, stretching like someone emerging from a long sleep, ready to reclaim the territory that had been surrendered one small defeat at a time. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations with government agencies, lawyers, and possibly police. Grace would have to explain how she had allowed her life to be stolen so thoroughly, would have to admit to strangers that she had been naive enough to trust a man who had systematically betrayed that trust. The prospect was humiliating and frightening. But tonight, for the first time in years, Grace felt connected to the woman she had been before marriage had taught her to make herself smaller. She felt worthy of protection, deserving of justice, capable of fighting for herself with the same fierce determination she had once brought to fighting for others. Grace returned to the bed and picked up her phone, scrolling through the contacts until she found her father's number. It was late, but Edward had always been a night owl, and she needed to hear his voice before she could sleep. "Gracie?" Edward's voice was alert despite the hour. "Everything okay?" Grace took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "Daddy, I need to tell you something about Mark. About my marriage. And I need to ask for your help." The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. When Edward spoke again, his voice carried the weight of suspicions finally confirmed. "I've been waiting for this call for a long time, baby girl. Tell me everything." As Grace began to speak, unfolding the story of financial manipulation and medical fraud that had defined her recent years, she felt the last vestiges of shame and secrecy falling away. The truth was ugly and complicated, but it was hers to tell, and she was finally strong enough to tell it. Her father listened without interruption, his breathing the only sound on the line as Grace described the Medicare fraud, the hidden bank statements, the systematic erosion of her autonomy and dignity. When she finished, the silence felt different than before, not empty, but full of the kind of quiet fury that had once made Edward Carter a formidable opponent in business negotiations. "What do you need?" he asked finally. Grace smiled, feeling something like peace settle into her chest for the first time in months. "I need you to remember that you raised me to fight for what's right, even when it's hard. And I need you to help me remember that I'm worth fighting for. Baby girl," Edward sighed, his voice soft with pride and regret, "you've always been worth fighting for. I should have fought harder to help you see that." Grace closed her eyes, finally ready to sleep in a place where her worth was not negotiable and her truth was not subject to someone else's interpretation. Tomorrow the real work would begin, but tonight she was exactly where she needed to be, safe, supported, and prepared to reclaim every piece of herself that had been taken. The battle for her life was about to begin in earnest, but Grace Miller was no longer afraid of the fight. The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that comes after storms. Grace woke in Eleanor's guest room to the smell of coffee and bacon, sounds of purposeful activity drifting from the kitchen below. For the first time in months, she had slept without the anxiety dreams that usually plagued her. Nights no faceless bureaucrats demanding explanations she couldn't provide, no endless hallways of locked doors she couldn't open. Eleanor stood at the stove when Grace entered the kitchen, her silver hair pinned in a neat bun, wearing a floral apron that had seen decades of service. The older woman moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent years managing households and classrooms with equal competence. Your father called an hour ago, Eleanor said without preamble, sliding scrambled eggs onto a plate. He's been making phone calls since dawn. Apparently, when you run a successful construction company for 40 years, you develop contacts in interesting places. Grace accepted the plate with hands that no longer trembled. What kind of contacts? Eleanor's smile was sharp as a blade. The kind that can access corporate records, bank statements, and insurance databases without waiting for court orders. The kind that understand the difference between legal technicalities and actual justice. The coffee was strong and black, exactly what Grace needed to steady herself for whatever revelation was coming. Through Eleanor's kitchen window, she could see her neighbors' children playing in their backyard, their laughter. A reminder that normal life continued even when individual worlds collapsed. Eat first, Eleanor instructed, settling across the table with her own breakfast. Your father will be here in 20 minutes, and you'll need your strength for what he's discovered. Grace managed 3 bites before her father's distinctive knock echoed through the house. Edward Carter entered Eleanor's kitchen carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the expression he had perfected during decades of difficult business. Negotiations calm on the surface, but with something dangerous moving underneath. Baby girl, he said, kissing Grace's forehead before taking a seat at the table. His eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep. But his voice carried the kind of controlled fury that had once made careless subcontractors reconsider their mistakes. Edward opened his briefcase and removed a stack of papers thick enough to represent months of investigative work compressed into a single night. Grace, what I'm about to tell you is going to hurt. But it's also going to end this. Grace set down her coffee cup, meeting her father's gaze with steady determination. I'm ready. Edward spread the first set of documents across Eleanor's table. Bank statements, credit reports, and transaction histories painted a picture of systematic financial abuse that was even more extensive than Grace had imagined. Mark has been using your Social Security income to pay Linda's rent for 2 years, Edward began, his finger tracing columns of numbers. Every month, your benefits are electronically deposited into an account he controls, and the money is immediately transferred to cover her living expenses. Grace's breath caught. My Social Security is supposed to pay our household expenses. It does, Edward continued grimly. After Linda's bills are covered, what's left barely covers utilities and food. That's why you've been living on credit cards and emergency assistance. Your income has been diverted to support his mother while you've been gradually impoverished. Eleanor leaned closer to examine the bank statements. How is this legal? Don't Social Security benefits have protections against this kind of misuse? Edward's expression grew darker. They do. But Mark obtained representative payee status by claiming Grace was mentally incompetent to manage her own finances. He provided medical documentation to support the claim. Grace felt the room spinning slightly. Medical documentation? From where? From Dr. Patel's clinic, Edward replied, pulling out another stack of papers. The same place where someone has been using your Medicare information. According to these records, you've been diagnosed with progressive dementia, anxiety disorder, and diabetic complications that affect your decision-making capacity. The words hit Grace like physical blows. On paper, she was a woman so mentally impaired that she required a guardian to protect her from her own incompetence. The fictional version of herself was helpless, confused, and completely dependent on Mark's management for survival. But I've never been diagnosed with any of those conditions, Grace whispered. I've never even been to that clinic. Edward's next revelation was even more devastating. Linda has been impersonating you for over a year. She uses your Medicare card, provides your Social Security number, and claims to be Grace Miller seeking treatment. The clinic staff believes she is you. Eleanor's fork clattered against her plate. How is that possible? Don't they check identification? Linda claims to have lost her ID and provides alternative verification: Medicare card, Social Security number, date of birth. She explains that she's estranged from her family and has no one to help her replace her documentation. It's a sob story designed to evoke sympathy and bypass normal verification procedures. Grace stared at the medical records that bore her name but described someone else's symptoms, someone else's treatments, someone else's mental decline. So while Linda gets medical care using my insurance, I'm portrayed as too mentally impaired to manage my own affairs. It's a perfect circle. There's more, Edward sighed quietly, pulling out a third set of documents. Mark has been applying for additional benefits in your name. Supplemental security income for disabled individuals. Emergency assistance programs. Food stamps. Every program available to help vulnerable seniors. The scope of the fraud was breathtaking. Grace's identity had been weaponized against every social safety net designed to protect people exactly like her. She existed on paper as a severely disabled woman who required extensive government support, while in reality she lived in poverty. Created by the very person claiming to protect her. How much money are we talking about? Grace asked. Edward consulted his notes. Over the past 2 years, approximately $43,000 in direct benefits fraud, plus Medicare fraud totaling another $18,000. The credit card debt run up in your name adds another $22,000. Eleanor let out a low whistle. That's more than most people make in a year. It gets worse, Edward continued. Mark has been collecting caregiver payments from Medicare for providing home care to his disabled wife. He's being paid by the government to take care of you, while simultaneously claiming you're too impaired to live independently. Grace felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. The man she had trusted with her life had turned her existence into a profitable enterprise. Harvesting money from her identity while systematically destroying her autonomy and self-respect. What about the car? She asked. Edward's smile was grim. The Camry was purchased using a loan secured against your future Social Security benefits. You're technically paying for a car that was immediately transferred to Linda's use. The registration shows her as the primary driver, but you're responsible for all payments and insurance. Grace stood up abruptly, pacing to Eleanor's window where she could see the world continuing its normal rhythm outside. Children rode bicycles on sidewalks, neighbors chatted over garden fences, and delivery trucks made their rounds to people whose lives weren't built on elaborate lies. They've stolen everything, she said quietly. Not just money. They've stolen my identity, my competence, my right to exist as an adult in the world. Edward joined her at the window, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. That's exactly right. And now we're going to help you steal it back. Grace turned to face her father, seeing in his expression the same determination that had built Carter Homes from a one-man operation into a regional success story. What do you mean? I mean we're going to turn their own weapons against them, Edward replied. Returning to the table where the evidence lay spread like artillery shells waiting to be fired. Every lie they've told, every document they've forged, every dollar they've stolen, it's all going to become evidence in a federal investigation that will destroy them. Eleanor cleared the breakfast dishes with quick, efficient movements, transforming her kitchen from a dining area into a war room. What do you need from us? Edward pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. I've already spoken to 3 different federal agencies. The Social Security Administration's Office of Inspector General, the Department of Health and Human Services Fraud Division, and the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. They're all very interested in this case. Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in years, hope backed by power. What happens next? Next, we gather more evidence. I want you to call Drive Patel's clinic and schedule an appointment for this afternoon. When you arrive, you're going to prove that you are not the confused, disabled woman their records describe. You're going to demonstrate that someone has been impersonating you, and you're going to demand answers. Eleanor nodded approvingly. And we'll be there to witness everything. Multiple witnesses to verify your mental competence and document their reaction when they realize they've been defrauded. Edward pulled out a small recording device. Texas is a one-party consent state. You can legally record any conversation you're part of. We're going to document everything they say when confronted with the truth. Grace took the device, its weight substantial in her palm. For months, she had felt like evidence was being used against her, truth twisted into weapons for her own destruction. Now, finally, she would be the one collecting evidence, building a case, controlling the narrative. What about Mark and Linda? She asked. Edward's expression hardened. Let them keep lying. Every additional lie they tell will be one more count against them when the federal prosecutors build their case. The deeper they dig, the harder they'll fall. Grace looked around Eleanor's kitchen, at the evidence spread across the table, at the allies who had appeared when she most needed them. A week ago, she had been a confused, isolated woman questioning her own perceptions. Today, she was the central figure in a federal investigation that would restore not just her money, but her dignity. "I want to be there when they find out," she said quietly. Edward smiled, the expression carrying decades of satisfaction earned through fair dealing and honest work. "Baby girl, you're not just going to be there. You're going to be the one who brings them down." As they prepared to leave for the clinic, Grace caught sight of herself in Eleanor's hallway mirror. The woman looking back was still 62 years old, still bore the lines that worry and disappointment had carved around her eyes. But something fundamental had changed in her bearing. She stood straighter, her chin raised, her gaze direct and unflinching. This was what justice looked like in its early stages, not the dramatic courtroom scenes from television, but the quiet gathering of truth, the patient assembly of facts, the transformation of a victim into a witness with the power to change everything. Grace Miller was ready to reclaim her life, one documented lie at a time. The confrontation at Drive Patel's clinic unfolded with the methodical precision of a controlled demolition. Grace walked through the glass doors at exactly 2 o'clock. Flanked by Edward and Eleanor, carrying the small recording device in her purse and 30 years of suppressed anger in her heart. The receptionist who had helped them the day before looked up with recognition and growing alarm. Behind the desk, Grace could see Carol Peterson, the office manager, speaking urgently into a phone while shuffling through a stack of files with Grace's name on the tabs. "Mrs. Miller," Carol said, emerging from the administrative area with the kind of forced smile that preceded difficult conversations. "I wasn't expecting you back so soon." Grace placed her identification on the reception counter with deliberate care. "I'm here for my appointment. The one I supposedly made while I was volunteering at church last Tuesday." Carol's face went pale as she compared Grace's driver's license photo to something on her computer screen. After a long moment, she looked up with an expression of growing horror. "Mrs. Miller, I think we need to talk privately." In Carol's cramped office, surrounded by filing cabinets and motivational posters about diabetes prevention, Grace listened as the office manager slowly unraveled the truth she had been denying for months. Linda Miller had indeed been impersonating Grace, using her Medicare information to receive treatment, while spinning an elaborate story about Grace's mental incapacity and family estrangement. "She was very convincing," Carol said, her voice small and defensive. "She knew all your personal information, social security number, address, medical history. She cried when she talked about your condition, said you didn't recognize her anymore." Edward leaned forward, his businessman's instincts taking over. "What kind of medical history did she provide?" Carol pulled a thick file from her cabinet, the weight of it testament to the depth of Linda's deception. "Progressive Alzheimer's disease, diagnosed 3 years ago. Diabetes complications affecting cognitive function. Severe anxiety that made it impossible for you to leave home without a caregiver." Grace felt sick listening to the fictional version of her life. According to these records, she was a woman so far gone that she couldn't remember her own daughter-in-law's name, couldn't manage basic self-care, couldn't be trusted with decisions more complex than choosing what to wear. "Who provided this medical history?" Eleanor asked. "Your son-in-law, Mark Miller," Carol replied, consulting her notes. "He brought in documentation from your previous doctor when Linda first became a patient here. Said you'd been seeing a geriatrician in Houston but had to stop when your condition worsened." Edward's jaw tightened. "What kind of documentation?" Carol hesitated, clearly beginning to understand the scope of the fraud she had unknowingly facilitated. "Medical summaries, prescription lists, a letter from your previous physician confirming the diagnosis and recommending local care." Grace knew without seeing them that every document was fabricated. Mark's brother worked in medical administration. Creating false paperwork would have been well within his capabilities. The elaborate nature of the deception was both impressive and terrifying. "I want copies of everything," Grace said firmly. "Every form, every note, every document with my name on it." Carol nodded slowly, her professionalism warring with her growing panic about legal liability. Mrs. Miller, I have to ask if you've never been our patient, and Linda Miller has been impersonating you, then we've been committing Medicare fraud. Unintentionally, but still. Yes, Grace replied calmly. You have. The question now is whether you're going to help fix this or continue enabling it. An hour later, Grace sat in Edward's Mercedes. With a box of copied medical records on her lap and a recording device that had captured every detail of Carol Peterson's confession. The clinic staff had been horrified to discover they had been unwitting accomplices to a federal crime. But their cooperation in documenting the fraud had been complete and immediate. Edward's phone rang as they sat in the parking lot. The caller ID showed a number Grace didn't recognize, but Edward's expression suggested he had been expecting this call. Agent Morrison, Edward answered, putting the call on speaker. Do you have news for us? The voice that emerged from the phone was crisp and professional, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with complex financial crimes. Mr. Carter, we've completed our preliminary investigation based on the information you provided. I'm calling to inform you that we executed search warrants this morning on both Mark Miller's residence and his mother's apartment. Grace's heart raced. While she had been confronting the clinic staff, federal agents had been gathering evidence from her own home. What did you find? Edward asked. Extensive documentation of the fraud scheme, Agent Morrison replied. Forged medical records, false power of attorney documents, and detailed records of benefit applications submitted in Mrs. Miller's name. We also found over $12,000 in cash hidden in Linda Miller's apartment, along with Medicare cards and Social Security documents for 3 other elderly individuals. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. Other people? Yes, ma'am. It appears your husband and mother-in-law have been operating this scheme against multiple seniors. You're not their only victim. The revelation hit Grace like a physical blow. She had spent months believing she was the target of a personal betrayal, only to discover she was just one mark in a larger criminal enterprise. Mark and Linda hadn't chosen to victimize her because of some flaw in her character or their marriage. They had chosen her because she fit their victim profile. Where are they now? Grace asked. Both in federal custody, Agent Morrison replied. They were arrested this morning on charges of Social Security fraud, Medicare fraud, identity theft, and elder financial abuse. The arraignment is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Grace stared out the window at the medical complex where her identity had been stolen and her reality had been systematically dismantled. In one day, the elaborate structure of lies that had defined her recent life had collapsed. Completely, revealing the truth that had been hidden beneath layers of manipulation and gaslighting. What happens next? Edward asked. Mrs. Miller will need to file victim impact statements and work with our restitution team to recover stolen funds, Agent Morrison explained. The good news is that we've frozen all accounts connected to the fraud. Mrs. Miller should be able to recover most of her stolen benefits within a few months. Grace closed her eyes, feeling something like relief wash over her for the first time in years. The money was important, but more crucial was the official acknowledgement that she had been the victim of crimes, rather than the confused participant in family financial planning. Agent Morrison, Grace said, finding her voice, will I have to testify against them? Most likely, yes. But Mrs. Miller, I want you to know that your case represents one of the most comprehensive elder fraud prosecutions we've seen in this district. Your willingness to come forward and provide evidence is going to help us protect other seniors from similar victimization. After the call ended, Grace sat quietly in her father's car, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. This morning she had been a woman questioning her own perceptions. This evening she was a key witness in a federal prosecution that would likely send her husband and mother-in-law to prison. How do you feel? Eleanor asked gently. Grace considered the question carefully. She felt relieved, certainly, and vindicated in ways that went beyond the recovery of stolen money. But underneath those emotions lay something more complex, a profound sadness for the marriage that had never really existed, for the trust that had been weaponized against her, for the years she had lost to lies and manipulation. I feel free, she said finally. And terrified. And grateful. And completely exhausted. Edward reached over and squeezed her hand. That's exactly how you should feel after surviving something like this. The drive to Eleanor's house passed in comfortable silence, the Dallas skyline glowing in the afternoon sun as they made their way through neighborhoods where other families were dealing with ordinary problems, traffic jams and dinner plans and children's homework. Grace watched the normal world pass by and marveled at how different everything looked when viewed through the lens of truth rather than deception. That evening, as Grace sat in Eleanor's living room with a cup of tea and the local news playing softly in the background, her phone rang. Mark's number appeared on the screen, calling from what she now knew was a federal holding facility. Grace stared at the phone for 3 rings before answering. "Gracie?" Mark's voice sounded smaller than she had ever heard it, stripped of the confidence and authority that had dominated their interactions for decades. "Gracie, please listen to me. This is all a misunderstanding. The investigators, they're making it sound worse than it is." Grace set down her tea and walked to Eleanor's kitchen, where she could speak privately. "Mark, I know about all of it. The Medicare fraud, the Social Security theft, the other victims. I know about the fake medical records you created to make me seem incompetent." "That wasn't about you," Mark said quickly. "That was it was paperwork. Bureaucratic stuff to get the benefits we deserved. You weren't being hurt." Grace felt a familiar pattern beginning. Mark's attempt to redefine reality, to minimize his actions and shift responsibility. But this time, instead of feeling confused or defensive, she felt only a cold clarity that cut through his words like a blade through tissue paper. "Mark," she said quietly, "I recorded my conversation with the clinic today. I have copies of the medical records you falsified. I know about Linda impersonating me, about the forged power of attorney documents, about the caregiver payments you collected for taking care of a wife you were simultaneously claiming was mentally incompetent." The silence on the other end stretched for nearly a minute. When Mark spoke again, his voice carried a note of desperation Grace had never heard before. "What do you want, Gracie? Money? I can pay everything back. Mom and we'll find a way to make this right. Just don't testify against us. Please." Grace looked through Eleanor's kitchen window at the garden where tomatoes grew in neat rows and marigolds stood guard along the fence. Everything about this house spoke of choices made by someone who understood the difference between what was expedient and what was right. "I want my life back," she said simply. "My name, my money, my right to exist in the world without someone else's permission. And I want to make sure you never do this to anyone else. Gracie, please." Grace ended the call and turned off her phone. In the living room, Eleanor looked up from her book with a questioning expression. "How did that go?" she asked. Grace returned to her chair and picked up her tea, the ceramic warm against her palms. "It went exactly how it needed to go." Later that evening, as Grace prepared for bed in the guest room that had become her sanctuary, she found herself thinking about her father's roses. Edward had planted them before her wedding, roots set deep in soil he had prepared with care and patience. Those roses had bloomed for decades because they had been given the right conditions to thrive: good soil, adequate water, protection from pests, and room to grow according to their own nature. Grace had spent 30 years trying to bloom in poisoned soil, her growth stunted by lies that masqueraded as protection. But now, finally, she had been transplanted to ground where truth could take root and flourish. Tomorrow would bring the arraignment, victim statements, and the long process of rebuilding a life that had been systematically dismantled. There would be paperwork and court appearances, difficult conversations with government agencies, and the challenge of learning to trust her own judgment after years of having it undermined. But tonight, for the first time in decades, Grace Miller went to sleep knowing that she was safe, that her perceptions were accurate, and that the truth, however painful, was infinitely preferable to the most comfortable lie. Justice, she realized, wasn't just about punishment for wrongdoing. It was about restoration of dignity, validation of reality, and the recognition that some things, like a person's right to control their own life, were too precious to be bartered away for the sake of keeping peace. Grace slept deeply that night, dreamless and undisturbed, while across town in a federal holding facility, Mark Miller discovered what it felt like to have his freedom controlled by someone else's decisions and to finally understand that consequences, like bills, always came due in the end. 6 months later, Grace Miller stood at the kitchen counter of her new apartment, measuring coffee into a machine that belonged entirely to her. The morning sunlight streamed through windows she had chosen herself, illuminating a space that reflected her tastes rather than someone else's compromise. On the refrigerator door, a photo showed her and Eleanor at the Senior Center's Volunteer Appreciation Dinner. Both women smiling with the satisfaction of work well done. The apartment was modest but comfortable, located in a complex designed specifically for active seniors. Grace's neighbors included retired teachers, nurses, and business owners, people who had built lives of purpose and were continuing to do so with the wisdom that comes from experience. Her monthly rent was covered entirely by the Social Security benefits that had been restored to her control, supplemented by restitution payments from the federal case that had sent Mark and Linda to prison. The morning routine had become a source of quiet pleasure. Grace prepared her breakfast while listening to news radio, checked her calendar for the day's activities, and sorted through mail that arrived addressed to her alone. No one intercepted her Medicare statements or questioned her ability to manage her own affairs. The simple act of opening an envelope without supervision felt like a small miracle even months later. Today was special. Grace was scheduled to speak at a community workshop about elder financial protection, sharing her story with other seniors who might recognize the warning signs she had missed for so many years. The invitation had come through the district attorney's office, part of an ongoing effort to educate vulnerable populations about financial abuse within families. As Grace prepared her presentation materials, she reflected on how much had changed since that terrible night when the lights went out in Mark's duplex. The woman who had sat in darkness, dependent on others for the most basic necessities, felt like a character from someone else's story. The Grace Miller who lived in this sunny apartment bore the same name but had reclaimed the confidence and clarity that had been systematically stripped away over decades of manipulation. The phone rang as Grace finished her second cup of coffee. Edward's number appeared on the display, bringing the warmth that always accompanied conversations with her father. "Morning, baby girl." Edward's voice carried the contentment of a man who had seen justice served and his daughter restored to independence. "Ready for your big speech today?" Grace smiled, settling into the chair by her window where she could watch her neighbors tending to the community garden. "I think so, though I still can't believe people want to hear my story. Grace, you prevented other families from going through what we went through. The prosecutor told me your testimony was crucial in getting those convictions. That's something to be proud of." The trial had concluded 3 months ago with guilty verdicts on all federal charges. Mark received 4 years in prison for Social Security fraud, Medicare fraud, and identity theft. Linda received 3 years for her role in the scheme. Both had been ordered to pay full restitution, though Grace knew the money mattered less than the official recognition that she had been the victim of crimes, rather than a confused participant in family financial planning. More importantly, the investigation had uncovered evidence of similar fraud against 4 other elderly individuals, leading to additional prosecutions and the recovery of hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen benefits. Grace's willingness to come forward had created a domino effect of justice that extended far beyond her own case. "Daddy, can I ask you something?" Grace said, watching a young mother push a stroller past her window. "Do you ever wonder if I would have figured it out on my own? Without the Medicare statement, without you helping with the investigation?" Edward was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same careful attention he brought to all important matters. "I think you were already figuring it out, Grace. You called that clinic on your own. You questioned the charges that didn't make sense. You trusted your instincts when everyone around you was telling you not to." Grace nodded, though he couldn't see her. In the months since the trial, she had wrestled with feelings of shame about how long the deception had continued, how thoroughly she had been convinced to doubt her own perceptions. But therapy sessions with a counselor who specialized in elder abuse had helped her understand that self-blame was another form of victimization. "I need to get ready," Grace said. "The workshop starts at 10, and I want to review my notes one more time." "You don't need notes to tell the truth," Edward replied. "Just speak from your heart. That's where the real wisdom lives." An hour later, Grace sat in a conference room at the community center, surrounded by 25 seniors who had gathered to learn about protecting themselves from financial predators. The audience included widows managing money for the first time in decades, retirees navigating Medicare enrollment, and adult children concerned about their aging parents' vulnerability. Grace began her presentation with the story of that first Medicare statement, the one that had listed medical appointments she had never made. She described the gradual erosion of her financial autonomy, the way small surrenders had accumulated into total dependence, and the sophisticated nature of the fraud scheme that had stolen not just her money but her sense of reality. The hardest part wasn't the financial theft, Grace explained, her voice steady and clear. It was learning that the person I trusted most in the world had systematically convinced me that I couldn't trust myself. When someone makes you doubt your own memory, your own perceptions, your own judgment, they steal something more valuable than money. They steal your confidence in your right to exist as a competent adult. An elderly man in the front row raised his hand. How do we protect ourselves from people we love? How do we stay vigilant without becoming suspicious of everyone? Grace had wrestled with this question in therapy and support groups. I think the key is remembering that love shouldn't require us to surrender our independence. Real protection comes from keeping some control over our own lives, even when it's easier to let someone else handle things. If someone who claims to love you consistently discourages you from understanding your own affairs, that's a warning sign worth paying attention to. A woman in her 70s spoke up from the back of the room. But what if we really don't understand complicated financial stuff? What if we genuinely need help? Then we get help from people whose job it is to provide help, Grace replied. Accountants, lawyers, financial advisors who are regulated and licensed. We don't sign over our independence to family members just because it's convenient for them to manage our affairs. Grace spent the next hour answering questions about warning signs of financial abuse, resources for seniors who suspected they were being victimized, and practical steps for maintaining financial autonomy while accepting appropriate assistance. The conversation was difficult but necessary, touching on the uncomfortable reality that elder abuse often came from within families rather than from strangers. After the workshop ended, several attendees approached Grace privately to share their own concerns about family financial arrangements. An 80-year-old woman confided that her son had been helping with her bills for 6 months. But she never saw statements anymore and wasn't sure where her money was going. A retired teacher mentioned that her daughter-in-law had convinced her to sign power of attorney documents, just in case, but now seemed to be making decisions without consulting her. Grace listened to each story with the patience and attention she had learned were essential for people who had been taught not to trust their own instincts. She provided contact information for elder advocacy services, legal aid organizations, and government agencies that could investigate suspicious financial activity. Most importantly, she validated their right to question arrangements that made them uncomfortable, even when those arrangements involved people they loved. As the afternoon faded into evening, Grace returned to her apartment feeling drained but purposeful. The work of helping other seniors protect themselves was emotionally demanding, requiring her to revisit her own traumatic experiences repeatedly. But it was also deeply satisfying, transforming her victimization into a source of strength for others facing similar challenges. Grace prepared a simple dinner and sat at her small dining table, surrounded by the quiet comfort of a life she controlled completely. Outside her window, the community garden showed the first signs of spring. Growth tomatoes and peppers planted by neighbors who tended them with care and patience. She thought about Mark, serving his sentence in a federal prison somewhere in Texas, probably convincing himself that he had been unfairly prosecuted for family financial arrangements that had gotten out of hand. She thought about Linda, who had written several letters demanding forgiveness and claiming she had only been trying to help family members in need. Grace felt no hatred toward them anymore, but she also felt no obligation to minimize their crimes or excuse their choices. They had stolen from multiple elderly victims, created elaborate lies to cover their theft, and destroyed trust that had taken decades to build. The consequences they faced were the natural result of decisions they had made repeatedly over years of deliberate deception. More importantly, Grace had learned that forgiveness didn't require her to forget what had happened or to restore relationships that had been built on lies. She could release her anger without surrendering her wisdom, could move forward without pretending that the past had been different than it was. As Grace prepared for bed, she reflected on the long journey from that night in Mark's darkened duplex to this moment of quiet contentment in her own space. The path had been difficult, requiring courage she hadn't known she possessed and support from people who had appeared exactly when she needed them most. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. Grace was scheduled to volunteer at the Senior Center's tax preparation program, helping elderly neighbors navigate forms that could be confusing and intimidating. Next week, she would testify in the civil case against Mark and Linda, seeking additional restitution for the years of financial abuse she had endured. But tonight, sitting in her own kitchen with a cup of tea and the local news playing softly in the background, Grace Miller felt something she hadn't experienced in decades: complete peace with her own life. She had faced the worst betrayal imaginable and emerged, not just intact but stronger, wiser, and more committed than ever to protecting others from similar victimization. Life doesn't end just because it breaks once. What falls apart can be the very place where we learn to stand again. If this story gave even a small moment of strength to someone out there, then everything I went through means something today. Grace had learned that resilience wasn't about avoiding pain or betrayal, it was about refusing to let those experiences define the limits of what was possible. She had discovered strength she didn't know she possessed, found allies in unexpected places, and reclaimed not just her money, but her fundamental right to trust her own perceptions and control her own destiny. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe, and share a piece of your own story in the comments below. Your words might become the seed of the next chapter we create together. Thank you for spending this time with me. Grace turned off the lights and headed toward her bedroom, passing the small mirror in her hallway that reflected a woman who had learned the difference between being alone and being independent, between keeping peace and keeping faith with herself, between surviving and thriving. The woman in the mirror was 63 years old, bore the lines that worry and wisdom had carved around her eyes, and possessed something that no one could steal: the absolute certainty that she was worth fighting for, worth protecting, and worth the continued effort of building a life based on truth rather than convenience. Grace Miller slept peacefully that night, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to help others find their own strength, to share the hard-won wisdom that came from refusing to surrender to injustice, and to continue building a life that honored both the pain she had endured and the resilience she had discovered. In the morning, she would wake in a bed she had chosen, in a room she controlled, to begin another day of a life that finally, completely, belonged